Right, sir. Uh, Once again, thank you so very much and welcome to iASPIRE ISBF Summer School Workshop. Good morning, students. We have today with us one of the leading macroeconomists of the country, Dr. Chetan Ghate. He's currently a professor of economics at the Indian Statistical Institute, New Delhi. He has also been a member of the Reserve Bank of India's first monetary policy committee, and he has completed his PhD in economics from Claremont Graduate University, California. His research interests lie in the field of macroeconomics and monetary economics. He is a strong proponent of research in the field of Indian macro, with a view to generate a better understanding of Indian macroeconomic policies and reforms using modern quantitative structural models. His recent research focuses on use of new Keynesian dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling to understand various macroeconomic phenomena, such as the inflationary impact of government intervention in agricultural markets, lack of monetary transmission in emerging market economies, EMEs, etc. Along with his professorial position at ISI New Delhi, he is currently also a member of the Editorial Advisory Board, Reserve Bank of India, occasional papers, and an external affiliate at Center for Research in Macroeconomics and Macrofinance, CRE-MMF, United Kingdom. And along with him, we also have our Associate Director, Mr. Chiraag Mehta. Dr. Ghate, I would now request you to please take the session ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me. And hi, everyone. I think the way that we're going to structure this session is, by the way, this session is going to be much more fun if we were sitting in an audience and I could throw a ball at all of you and make sure that whoever caught the ball was the person who's going to answer the question. But I can't do that. But I think the best way to do this is that you just kind of raise your hand or intervene whenever you want. Let's keep this completely informal, and if you have any questions, then I'll address them for sure. And I've been given a set of questions in advance. So Chirag, do you want to ask them, or should I structure my talk
Absolutely,
along? Okay, so.
Absolutely, sir. Happy to step in and do that. So in fact, just wanted to echo Siddharth's sentiments. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure and honor to have you with us, sir. The students do try and make the most of this session. Dr. Ghate has had an illustrious career in research and academia, and you have the opportunity to quote unquote pick his brains a little bit. I'll start that process for you, Dr. Ghate. One of the other things you'll find about this audience, they're a very motivated lot, as we were discussing on the test link. But as is well known, it's 9:50 in the morning, so they're trickling in. So I think we'll get up to full capacity in another 5-7 minutes. But we have about 35 students with us already. So as Dr. Ghate was saying, students, I'll ask Dr. Ghate a few questions to set the tone. But as he's invited you to do, please feel free to step in and ask questions, based on his answers or anything you want to clarify about my question by any chance. So feel free to step in by raising your hand or unmuting yourself as and when you feel the need to. So in fact, Dr. Ghate, Siddharth's introduction has set the tone for the first question. So I'll jump right into it. Given your illustrious journey, as I was saying, it would be lovely to just start by hearing an overview of that journey from your perspective, the highs and lows, the important milestones or decisions, and anything else you would like to share really that would benefit the students.
Yeah, sure. Well, the one proof that you guys are highly motivated is that you've landed up at 9:50 in the morning to hear me speak. So that's what makes you highly motivated, I guess. Okay, now, so let me tell you about my journey to becoming a macroeconomist. And my sense, and it's well-founded, I guess, to some extent, is that in India, people don't really know what economists do, right? Everybody studies economics, right? Everybody in class 11 and 12 wants to do economics. People in undergrad want to do economics, but when you ask the general population what economists do, especially in cities outside of Delhi and maybe Calcutta, where economics is probably better understood than the average population in India, most people don't understand what economists actually do, right? They have some hazy notion that it deals with maybe investment banking, maybe it deals to some extent with data analytics, or it deals with, ultimately leading. It's a stepping stone to leading to another career, like maybe getting an MBA or joining the IAS, but what is it that the body of knowledge, what skills does this particular body of knowledge give to a person, which then trains them for the outside professional world? And it's in that sense, I think most people don't really, I mean, when I say I'm an engineer, I kind of have a sense of what you do, right? Based on the kind of engineering you do. When I say you're a lawyer, I have a sense of what you do. When I say you're a doctor, I know what you do. But when I say you're an economist, it's hard to tell exactly what you do unless I again ask, okay, well, where are you working? And then you try and figure that out. So I think part of the journey of being an economist is understanding what is it that you do and what is it that you define as an economist is doing. Now, I'll get to that question in a second, but before that, I left India after class 7. So I didn't study in India for grade 8, grade 9, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12. I was abroad. And after grade 12, I went directly to the United States to do my undergraduate. And so I was away for about 9 years. And then I came back to India for 2 years to do my master's at the Delhi School of Economics. And then I went back to the United States to do my PhD. And then I worked in the US for about 3 years. I worked in Germany for 6 months. And then I finally came back to India in 2003. So I was away from for about 19 years, apart from those 2 years that I was in India for my master's. And economics, to me, as I began to, and I didn't study any economics in school, by the way. I was keen on getting into medicine, and then I switched. And I switched for the reason that I felt that I wanted to deal with larger problems related to public policy. And I enjoyed maths. And so one way to define what economists can do is try and address public policy with quantitative skills, like maths, like statistics, like finance. And that's one definition of probably that applies to what economists do. So for instance, if you're working in the environment sector, like climate change is a big deal now, right? So today, the National Public Radio in the United States was saying that the month of June was the hottest in the last many, many years in the contiguous US, 73 degrees Fahrenheit. You've all been hearing about heat waves in British Columbia. So let's say climate change or climate science or environmental economics is ultimately the field you get into, and economics is your entry into that field. Then an environmental economist is thinking about cost benefit analysis of maybe new fossil fuel technologies. Should we have electric cars or not? You know, it's a kind of a public policy question that is using maths and statistics and econometrics and analytical skills to deal with those kinds of questions. So broadly, what I think of economics is are public policy questions that are relevant at a societal level, and it's using quantitative skills to get a handle on those questions. Now, as I trudged through college, again, as I said, in school, I thought I wanted to do medicine, and then I decided not to do it. When I got to university, it's only in my third year when I actually took my first course in macroeconomics, or maybe, yeah, end of second year, not third year, end of second year that I took my first. And immediately, like a light went off in my head, and I said, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. This makes perfect sense. The questions excited me, the issues excited me, and macro is such a dynamic field. I mean, it changes every day, which makes it a pleasure to teach to undergrads and students, because there's always something new to talk about every day. And it's those questions proposed by macro that I felt were interesting to me. Now, what are these questions? And are these questions possibly interesting to you? Well, let's think about economic growth. Let's think about standards of living, right? all countries desire to be prosperous and become high-growing economies and have, low poverty rates and give their citizens a decent quality of life. Now, macroeconomics provides solutions to these kinds of questions. So something like that, which was close to my heart, which was, how do we think about development? How do we think about growth? How do we think about prosperity for people in our country? And it doesn't need to be people in your country. It can be, people around the planet, are questions that macroeconomics provides answers for. So I was interested in those questions, and therefore I got interested in the field. The other thing that I then also started getting interested in is understanding what inflation is about. It's something we see every day, right? We see the prices of things going up. Sometimes they go down. When you go shopping for vegetables with your parents or by yourselves, you'll notice that prices of fruit, vegetables change based on whether the monsoon is good or bad, based on whether there's COVID or not, based on whether there's demonetization or not. So the prices of things change. And the prices is something that we pay for. It's out-of-pocket expenses. And therefore, it has a welfare consequence. It's a bit like a tax. When prices go up, inflation is like a tax. It pinches you, right? And it became important to me understand what drives inflation, what central banks can do to control inflation. Is it only the central bank that can do stuff to control inflation, or can the government also do things to control inflation? Those questions at my undergraduate level became very interesting to me as I began to get exposed to preliminary theories around these things. I started saying to myself, wow, this is really nice. This is really interesting. And then the fact that I enjoyed using maths and I enjoyed using statistics, it was almost like a perfect blend for me, because the quantitative side, the questions, it was like a perfect meeting point. And I said, yes, this is kind of what I want to do. So that's how I kind of stumbled upon it. And one of the things that was weighing on my mind also was that in medicine, I thought it was going to be at least 10 years of education. And that, from the standpoint of an 18-year-old, that looks like a hell of a long time after your class 12 to be invested in education. But as it turned out, to become a professor of economics at an entry level, you do still have to do 10 years of education. I mean, undergrad in the United States was 4 years, a master's was 2 years, that's 6. And my PhD was 4, but typically a PhD is 5 or 6. So it's 10 to 12 years of additional invested time. So don't think that by doing this, you're taking a shortcut if you want to get into research and the academy. It's a 10-year slog. And that 10-year slog is something that, I guess, in your head, if you want to think about how to justify it to yourself, because you're going to be consuming your entire 20s doing this, and there's an opportunity cost to doing that. You could be working in the private sector, you could be making money, you could be, it's almost as if it's the investment done to pick up a set of skills that allow you to have a societal impact with ultimately the skills you develop. And one last thing, general advice, very important in life to not let money drive what you want to do. Money will come along the way no matter what you do. You must figure out what you love to do. And partly what you love, what subjects you love, what field you love, whether it's economics or not, is also contingent on how good you are at something. If you're not very good at, I don't know, if you don't have an ear for music, you may love music and you will do music, and that's fine. But it will be hard to be a professional musician, right? And I think, and you may still continue to do it, and good luck. But what I'm saying is that finding what you do is don't let the financial aspect of it decide what you want to do or where you want to go. Go to a field where you are interested in what the field is about. That's one aspect. The second aspect, for me, it was very important that once I was skilled and trained, is I wanted to be back here. I wanted to be a macroeconomist in India. And so I came back. I remember a somewhat hard day when it was many years ago when I had a one-way ticket on Air India and I was leaving the United States, and I was sitting on the plane and I was saying, oh my gosh, is this the right thing to do? I'm moving back to the ISI, I'm moving back to Delhi, I'm leaving, 19 years of living abroad. Is it the right thing to do? And it was not easy, but I think in the long run, it made sense, it worked out. And I feel internally that my societal contribution is much more being here than being one more qualified person in the United States or in an advanced country where there are tons of people. What we need is kind of people to come back and be here and contribute here. So it's really a mixture of all these things is to summarize, is to be interested in kind of macro questions, number one, which first hooked me. Number two, wanting to engage with these questions from a technical side, and many of you are science students, so you're already on that line. And if you're not in the science stream, but you're in the commerce stream, you're given that you study in India, you're also already on that line because maths tends to be pretty good here in grade 11 and grade 12. So combining maths with public policy questions in macro, the excitement of living and being in a large developing country which faces all kinds of tumultuous change, which makes your kind of career worthwhile. These are the kind of dimensions that made me get into the field and stay here. I guess that's the best way to put it. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that, sir. I think students, lots of very, very interesting nuggets there for you. The important decisions, the decision to leave the medical stream and switch to economics as a field, and so many other decisions, the decision to come back to India, to serve as a macroeconomist, which is not such a common sub-discipline as much as, so there's micro and macro in economics, but correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Ghate, but in India, micro seems to be by and large the preference of most economists, whereas macro is the one that makes in a much more direct way, the sort of public policy implications and changes. So that also creates a lot of space to contribute there as a central banker or otherwise. And also, students, a quick shout back to some of the things we spoke about in the careers in EMF landscape session. Dr. Ghate referred to the 10-year thing to become an expert. We've spoken about that briefly. I think as the gestation period is perhaps because you're talking about creating knowledge as a researcher. And if you think about something very elementary like Bloom's taxonomy, which is a hierarchy of learning outcomes, you can Google this and you see a pyramid of learning outcomes starting with understand, then remember, then apply, analyze, evaluate, and ultimately create. To get to the top of that pyramid where you can actually create new knowledge, which is what researchers do, and that's how you make seminal contributions, by expanding the body of knowledge that the world has to work with. I think that's why you need those 10,000 hours. And another beautiful point I was touched upon is that you need that intrinsic motivation to keep going. So try and find what you love. And I think that is the beauty of the opportunity that you guys have today, that I think I certainly didn't in my time. Dr. Ghate probably didn't at his time. We didn't have really, people in sessions talking to us about career choices in this kind of detail. It also means an information overload. So we understand it's not an unequivocal blessing. But at least you have the opportunity to try and truly understand, as he said, how do you make up your mind about a field without truly understanding what that profession is about? And that's a really challenging thing. A lot of people, many years into their career, don't really know exactly what their choice is going to pan out to be like in terms of work. So I think that little nugget there, especially about macroeconomics, about attacking public policy problems with quantitative techniques, is certainly one easy way for you to understand what you can do as an economic researcher anyway. So thank you very much for that, sir. I think you've also answered a part of the next question, so I'm going to shorten that a little bit and only ask you. So the first part was, why should any 18-year-old consider taking up a career in research and academia? I think you've done justice to that question already. If there's anything you'd like to add, please do so. But the second part, what opportunities does it offer? If you could maybe talk a little bit about, any allied opportunities that come along the way for researchers, aside from pure research and teaching. I think that would help the students make more sense. And Varenya has her hand raised, sir. Can we hear what she has to say?
Yeah, sure.
Before I ask you to answer. Varenya, go for it.
Hi, sir. So you stressed a lot about the quantitative part of public policy, and I was wondering whether there was a qualitative route you could take to the field as well, or a mixture of both.
Yeah, absolutely. So good question. Let me try and answer that along with the second part of the question. So by the way, when I said 10 years, this is not, baked in stone. So for 10 years is the way it works is an undergrad in India is typically 3 years. The US requires, if any of you are planning to go to the US for advanced studies after your undergrad, requires, as you know, 16 years of education. So most Indian kids do 15. So they do 3 plus 2, they do a master's, and then they apply after their first year in the master's. So they finish their master's degree. So they have, they essentially do 12 plus 5, right? 17 before they're entering into a PhD program. But a PhD is not for everybody, okay? You do a PhD if you are interested in a career in research, okay? That's the first thing. And a PhD typically takes 5 to 6 years after your master's, okay? So if you look at top CEOs today in the private sector, most of them, for instance, will have an undergraduate degree. And in the United States, for instance, an undergraduate degree can more or less be in, can be in anything. So look at the CEO of Crate and Barrel, which is a housing kind of furnishing company. So she has an undergraduate in English, and then I think a master's from INSEAD, which is an MBA. So most people interested in the corporate side of things and in the corporate ladder will typically have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree. And that could be in economics, MBA, or it could even be in engineering, MBA. If you're in the West, it could be in anything, because to get into a top school abroad, you just generally have to be bright. It doesn't matter what you ultimately study, and you generally have to be bright. So usually in the corporate sector, what suffices is a first degree and then a master's degree. Now, after that, if you still love the field and you want to be, just to pick up on what Chiraag was saying, is that when you are in this kind of 3 plus 2 or 4 plus 2 realm and you get into the private sector, I guess you are largely at this level of a student, a consumer of knowledge, right? You take the textbook as given, you take the article that is given to you as given, and you are asked to replicate it, to discuss it, you get assessed on it on exams. When you choose to become a researcher, you shift from being a consumer of knowledge to becoming a producer of knowledge, okay? And it's just like we go to factories and we make goods, or we go into the service sector and provide services. In research, we manufacture ideas. That's what we do. We produce ideas. And what's different about research compared to producing goods and producing services, I guess producing ideas is a service, and maybe you can even argue it's a good as well. But what is different is that the entire world is your competition. When I sit here in my office today and I write my next paper, I have to publish that in a journal where the entire planet, who's a macroeconomist, is also submitting papers to. Okay? So the entire world is your competition. So it may seem for researchers that, oh, that person is a researcher, they're kind of working in your office. Ultimately, to get something out there and for people to read, for it to get into a respectable place, means that your entire world is your competition. Number one. Number two, it's also a 365/7 slog in research. That doesn't mean you're sitting in your office from 9 in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. You may work for 5 hours, go for a run, come back. I have a son. In the evening, he plays soccer. Sometimes I join him. I come back to my office. I work. But it's a non-stop slog. In research, you don't survive unless, if it's 9 to 5 for you, and if you're very clear that, look, I'm going to be working X hours a day and the remaining amount of time is going to be for myself, research is probably not for you. But because the questions will keep lingering in your head. When you go home, you won't have been able to solve something. So you're going to go home, you're going to try and work it out. So it's going to be around. So remember that research for doing top level research means that the PhD track is for that. If you are interested in doing research, there's a question about at the qualitative level, or maybe even possibly at the think tank level in the capacity of an RA, or you want to become a public policy professional, you may not need to do a PhD. having a good master's where you pick up a bunch of skills is probably adequate. Okay. And that is then a 4+2 based on where you study, 4-year undergrad, 3-year undergrad plus 2 years master's typically. So that's roughly 6 years of time after your master's, after your high school. But for the private sector as well, for the corporate sector, I noticed top CEOs, some of them may have PhDs, but it's not a requirement. I think what's a requirement is essentially a good undergraduate degree and maybe a top business school or something like that. That seems to be the comparable thing. And then, of course, if you want to go into research, then you're investing 5 or 6 more years in getting into academics. Now, again, answering this question on the qualitative aspect. Economics becomes increasingly technical as you move along. In India, you do a little bit of maths when you do a BSc or a BA in economics at a good place. Let's say you do an honors course somewhere. As you move to the master's level, it becomes almost entirely mathematical. And as you move through the research level, it is almost all technical and mathematical. So at some point, if this is the area you want to be in, the math bar is going to hit you. You're going to have to ask yourself, am I good enough for this? Can I exceed it? Can I improve with work? And if you are somebody who's interested in, the technical side of the field, or you're interested in maths, it will be easier. If you find doing maths all the time or doing formal economics all the time daunting or something that may not be, then there are other variants of the degree that also work. So for instance, many people after their master's in economics actually go on and do a PhD in public policy. In a PhD in public policy, which is different from a PhD in economics, PhD in public policy, there are more qualitative approaches to thinking about policy questions. The math demand is not that high. The skill set required is strong, but the amount of, I guess, math, quantitative, formalism side of it is not as strong as it is in a PhD in economics. So there are public policy options, and there are some fabulous institutions where you can enroll as a public policy student and take courses in the economics department. So you can still finally engage with the field at the level that you're comfortable with, but overall, you must internalize maybe that quantitative skills are going to increase the value and your enjoyment of being in this field. And at some point, it's going to hit you. And that's something you should be clear about, because you won't survive as a researcher in economics unless you are interested in math and the formal side, because it becomes formal. In fact, it's quite instructive. I know people, for instance, who end up doing PhDs in engineering in the United States, and they had no idea about this, but when they start taking courses in economics in the same university, they say, oh my God, I mean, the maths here at the PhD level is exactly the same as a PhD in engineering. That's how steep the gradient is that at the undergraduate level, you get an exposure to macro history of economic thought, IO, elective, stats, whatever it is. And then you think, oh, this is nice. But then when you get to the master's level and India's top programs like ISI Delhi or the Delhi School of Economics, it's very, very quantitative. So, but then again, let me tell you, for those of you, we get many students in ISI at the master's level who have done undergraduate degrees in engineering, comp sci, maths, but they're not interested in just doing that. They want to apply it, and they're interested in the kinds of questions that either economics provides, macro provides. Maybe they're interested in poverty reduction type questions, or maybe they're interested in auctions, right? Maybe they're interested in game theory. Maybe they're interested, and they find that in those science fields or engineering fields, those broader questions are not interesting them. So we get many students, sometimes half of our class are basically engineering students who ultimately take that one course somewhere where they are, maybe in the IITs or somewhere else, and say, oh no, these questions are really interesting. And then they gravitate towards a technical program like ours. So since this is a talk on research and being in the academy and not being in the private sector, This is what I'm emphasizing is that the qualitative approach will probably take you to a broader public policy field. But if you want to stick to being an economist, a research economist, you will have to be invested in the quantitative area. Both provide very interesting careers and both are eminently possible. It's just that at some point, you have to make this decision about whether you like math enough to be doing it for the rest of your life.
Great, thank you, sir. So just a quick clarification and a follow-up really from my side before we get a couple more questions from the audience. Would you consider the field of behavioral economics as still relatively nascent in India in terms of being taught or research? Would you consider that as an attractive area for those that have less of an inclination towards the quantitative skills, or is behavioral research also quite quantitative at sort of higher levels?
Yeah, it's a very hot field. It's becoming very important, but yes, I mean, it's all of economics is quantitative. You can't, unless you do economic history. But even economic history, remember that a lot of the subject has taken an empirical turn. In the last 20 years, economics is not guided by, not 20 years, maybe even 40 years, ideology that much anymore. I'm a lefty, I say we should do this. I'm a righty, I say we should do this. No, that's not how it is. I go out, I gather data. Either I have access to data from the Reserve Bank of India or somewhere else, or I go out and I gather my data. And then I analyze my data, and that data tells me something, right? So let me give you an example. Suppose I want to measure how frequently shops across the road from me right now in a big market, Katwaria Sarai market, how frequently do shopkeepers change their prices, right? Do they do it once every 3 months? Do they do it once every 6 months? Do they do it once every year? How frequently do I do that? Now, macroeconomists call this sticky prices, that prices tend to be sticky. That, like, you would think that, for instance, that when the economy slumps, and like it is somewhat now, when demand is low and no one's going out to buy anything, then shopkeepers may want to cut their prices, right? Because there's just no demand, right? But suppose I want to test that. And suppose I go out and suppose some existing theory tells me that, in a slump, prices crash. But now suppose I go out and let's say there are 1,000 flats over there, and I go to every door and I give them a survey, and I make sure that, these guys are shopkeepers. Number two, I do some preliminary tests, and I give them a survey. And I use that survey to figure out how frequently do shopkeepers in this market change their prices. Okay. Now that is evidence-based research. And this is the kind of work that happens at a much larger scale across millions of households, for instance. Look at what the recent Nobel Prize has been given to, 2019 to Abhijit Banerjee and to Esther Duflo. And if you haven't read this book called Poor Economics in 2019, all of you must buy it and read it. Again, the idea is they run experiments on huge numbers of people. They give a policy to one set and they don't give the policy to the other set. And both sets of people are identical. They have similar wealth levels. They have similar education backgrounds. And the only thing that is different across these two groups of people is that maybe one person has been given an additional amount of money, or one person has been given a treatment and the other group has not. That isolates that particular factor's role in generating the behavior you want to study. So the empirical turn in economics has made ideology in informing public policy decisions. And so to answer your question, the question is, I like behavioral economics, and does behavioral economics still mean that I have to slog away at numbers and things like that? And the answer, fortunately or unfortunately, is yes. But think of it this way, is that your ability to answer questions out of your research are much better with those quantitative skills. And so I would say, as a subject as a whole, behavioral, non-behavioral, macro, micro, the formalism is important. The empirical skills are important. And I said, by highlighting this particular example where you're actually going and surveying and things like that, you need to have those survey skills, those quantitative skills to analyze your data afterwards.
Super, great. So I think that provides a lot of clarity. Aryan, you had a question? Do you still have a question?
I think my question's answered.
Do you still have a question?
My question's
okay,
answered.
Super. Thanks. All right. Tushar, you had a question as well?
Yeah, so the first one got answered, but my second question would be that, coming from an international education background, so just like, studying in the US and then moving to, let's say India or another country, which, has a completely different and a completely different dynamic of the economy. What sort of differences, do you face, and what sort of challenges are there from like, another country, and try and apply the skills you learned there to a more localized economy?
Well, I mean, there's certainly personal adjustment issues, getting used to living here. It's not that I was in India till class 7, so it's not like, and I could speak Hindi throughout and so on. So the language was never a barrier. And but I think the answer to your question is, and at some point this becomes clear to everybody, is see what drives me is in my career choice is the sense of having an impact. I wanted to have an impact, and the money part of it was not that important. I didn't think that that I should stay on in the United States and try and make, whatever, become better off or well off. And so for me, what I wanted was having an impact. Now, you can have an impact by being in the US too. That's something. But for me, it was being here. I wanted to be a macroeconomist here, so I made the choice. And yes, there are huge differences culturally in this and that. But you must understand now, sitting in 2021, things are much better in India in academics. The salaries are quite high. Every university gives you research money. There's a little bit of conference travel money and so on. So it's not like you're just stuck here. In the earlier days, you kind of went to a conference once every 2-3 years. Now you can go to a conference once a year. So mobility is there, and then you have Zoom, you have Skype, you have a lot of research is now basically done online. I mean, just like I'm talking to all of you over here. Many days I spend hours and hours on the screen just doing research with co-authors. We just divide our respective parts and we're able to work. So it no longer feels like a one-way street like it did a long time ago. And the fact that it doesn't feel like a one-way street might mean, oh, you've left and then you're not there, and makes it easier to be in India. However, having said that, I still think the West, the US in particular, is the frontier for a lot of professions. And by being here, you do sometimes feel cut off, but that's an effort you have to make from your side to be engaged and be doing research, to be able to, make sure that that divide is not so daunting. And I came back also on a personal front. I came back before I was married, so I didn't have to, worry about whether my wife wanted to not come back. I didn't have children, so I was a bit footloose then. So that made things a lot easier.
Right, I've got 2 follow-up questions. So the first one, I think the question I was trying to ask, I should probably rephrase it. Not really on an interpersonal level and personal skills. I'm talking something like, when you study about case studies in foreign, countries, and most of the case studies and the learning is basically based around that economy, if I'm not wrong. And then when you come to, let's say, India, which has a completely different economy, to apply those skills you have into a completely, different scenario, what sort of difficulties do you face in that transition? That was the first question. And my second question, which would be now, is that would you say that an Indian education would have been equally as good as the education you received in the USA, if you wanted to work in India?
Okay, so on the first part, no, I don't think being a student in the US and being trained in the US is, I'm not sure if hindrance or limiting factor in plunging yourself into the issues of developing countries is a barrier. No, it's not. Partly because your initial years of education are essentially tool and skill based. You're picking up quantitative skills. You certainly have exposure to, as you all have probably some idea of economics, but if you do get into economics in your undergraduate level, you will be looking at, mostly textbooks that are written in the United States by Americans for understanding the US economy. And then your teacher is going to say something about, oh, by the way, it also kind of works here in this way. The thrust of your education in your undergraduate is also methodological, so that methodology translates no matter where you go. The applications are different, but it's not constraining. But what was your second question? Sorry.
So my question was that for example, you studied in the US and then you came to India, and you're using those skills you received there to apply here.
Is it so, no? Yeah. Are you at a disadvantage being here relative to being there?
No, that I was asking if an Indian education would have been equally as good or possibly better if you wanted to work in India as compared to getting a US education.
I think the limiting thing in an Indian undergraduate education may be that the priority given to students to be critical, to question, to have an independent mind may somewhat be less than a United States education. So we're good on skills and maths and tools, but I often find American undergrads, for instance, being maybe well versed with what's happening to the economy and what the budget deficit 40 years ago was, and bringing maybe reading or whatever it is, or interest in the field to the subject sometimes more. But I mean, is it? And I think, and I see this also amongst Indian students who later on continue to stay in economics, is while they're smart technically, their ability to ask original research questions tends to be limited. And I sometimes feel that American kids are very, very good at that, but what may sometimes be limiting in their sense is their math skills. So it's a bit opposite. So I think it's important, no matter where you go, is that when you go to an undergraduate program, it's important that your course structure is allowing you to think critically and not kind of mopping up what is being given to you, right? Your homework exercises, your class assignments, maybe paper assignments, your tests should make you think beyond the box and make you think critically of not accept what you're being taught, accept it, of course, but also think about how it applies to your current situation. And my sense in an Indian education is that aspect is sometimes missing, and it's something that that we need to focus on better.
Right, sir. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
And so I'd just like to weigh in there a little bit with my own impression of your question, Tushar, and just it's a very, very it's an area very close to our hearts at ISBF, which is why I want to weigh in. Is that what Dr. Ghate said? I think I completely agree with him as well, based on my experiences, which are still substantially lesser in years and breadth and depth than his. But nonetheless, I think I can say from my experience of going through school and also 3 years of undergrad, which were all in India, that the incentive structures, the teachers' body language, and all of those sorts of things, the examination patterns, they always made me feel I felt like a good student if I was not asking a question. That was the sort of mindset it ingrained in me, because I felt like I was signaling to the teacher that I've understood everything if I didn't ask a question, whereas I was never really truly evaluating whether or not I had understood fully. And it is actually after my master's, when I got a job for a couple of years in London, in my first review, that I was told a very pedantic thing by my manager, that you don't ask a lot of questions. And that's when I realized that I had systematically been trained out of that habit through my early years. And especially if you're staying on in research, etc., everything revolves around asking questions. You spend 6 years as a researcher, first identifying and then, finding an answer to a question. That is the sort of centrality of questions in all sort of academic pursuit and creating knowledge. So I think that's a huge difference that I'd like to sort of also completely agree with, and which is not usually. And from an education standpoint, I think a lot of the signals to teachers, to students, come from the final examination pattern, because curricula are relatively easy to copy across institutions. Every institution publishes their curricula, and you can always sort of, take the curricula almost, or the curriculum almost, from another institution. What you can't take is the intellectual sort of work that goes into designing an assessment. If the assessment does not reward skills like mopping up knowledge or sort of rote learning things, then you are forced to evaluate critically, or teachers are forced or incentivized is probably the right word, to teach you how to critically analyze things in class. And that makes a world of difference to the kind of sort of learner you are and researcher you are, arguably. So just wanted to kind of share that as well. Dr. Ghate, those were the questions that were pending. Students, please keep them coming. This is wonderful. I think so. We've gone through a lot of. You've even touched upon something like a day in the life of an EMF researcher when you spoke about sort of doing research a little bit and then heading out for a run and then coming back and doing some more work and then probably going out to play soccer with your son. I think a couple of things that perhaps remain from the set of questions I wanted to ask you, just coming back to something I'd mentioned earlier, was if you could talk a little bit about anything else that you'd like to talk about to students that is really exciting about research. I think you've pointed out a fair few things already, but anything else there? And the other is any allied opportunities. So they get a sense of, anything you can do in sort of policy, public policy, even if you're primarily attached with a university as a professor, so maybe such as your work with the RBI, the Monetary Policy Committee, or anything like that. That would be useful to know.
Yeah, I guess what excites me most about this line of work or this career path is the creative process, and the fact that what comes out is something new. Research is a new idea, and it takes, a long time for ideas and research to filter down. But just the sense that your input, however small it is or big it is, it just depends on, how the field takes up what you do. It's exciting to think that it changes the way that policy is practiced, and that's ultimately impact. As I said, impact guides me a lot. It's governed my choices in life. I wanted to make a difference. And there are many ways to make a difference. You can make a difference by being a social worker. You can make a difference by being a doctor. You can make a difference by being a good person. There are many ways to make a difference. And all of us, your teachers are making a difference. You are making a difference to your friends by the actions you take every day. But in the sense of making a professional difference, and I'm a little old-fashioned in this sense, is that I've always felt that contributing back here was important. That gives me excitement every day, getting up in the morning and doing what I do. The creative line gives me excitement because the newness of the most recent paper idea is thoroughly exciting to me. So those two things, the sense of being here, the creative process, are really kind of important, I guess, to me. Yeah.
And so if you could speak briefly about the sort of allied opportunities that research, that a career in research presents, I think that would be useful for students.
Correct. I see. Yes. Okay. Now, so by the way, this is a good pitch for macroeconomics, because as Chiraag was saying, most Indian students, certainly later on, professionals, professionals partly to get into microeconomics or allied fields. And there's a huge scarcity of good macroeconomists in India. And therefore there's a lot of scope for doing good work in this particular field. Now, this is a good example of how how public policy can rely on the skills that a macroeconomist has at this level. So the Reserve Bank of India is the apex authority, so to speak, that does a lot of things, by the way. They're the regulator of the banking system. They make sure that the banking system doesn't go belly up. They make sure there's enough currency floating around in ATMs so that when you go to the ATM, there's currency. They make sure the exchange rate is not going from 70 to 100 to 150 and back down to 20 every day. And the job that they are tasked with is to keep inflation at a somewhat reasonable level, which we define to be about 4%. Okay. Now, that's called inflation targeting, by the way. It's very interesting. So the central bank over the medium term has to keep inflation at 4%. And just imagine all the things hitting the economy on a daily basis, right? There could be capital outflows, governments may change, there could be a natural calamity. Amongst all of this, then even in the reform process, look at all the reforms that have happened in the last, let's say 10 years, 7 years. We've had the GST, we've had demonetization, there are protests outside of Delhi on agricultural sector reforms. There's a new labor code that is being introduced. There's an insolvency and bankruptcy code, and we can go on and on. The job of a macroeconomist is to filter all those things in terms of some kind of model to figure out how it's going to affect inflation, which is said to be 4%. Now that's a fascinating question, right? So you've got to use all your technical skills and say, well, if the labor laws happen, then that's going to probably do this and this and this, and that should make inflation do this and this. If demonetization happens, that's going to do this and this, and that's going to affect inflation and make it go up or go down, whatever it is. So this is an example where your academic skills is impacting policy. Now, the way it works is that the Reserve Bank of India has a monetary policy committee. In 2016, it was a long process before that led to this, to an amendment of the RBI Act. But in 2016, the government of India set up a monetary policy committee, and the monetary policy committee was the committee that was going to decide what the key overnight lending rate is between banks. Okay? And banks basically can borrow with each other in the wholesale money market, right? And the wholesale money market is called the weighted average call rate. But if they're short on liquidity, for instance, they can actually borrow from the Reserve Bank of India. That's called the repo rate. Now, the Monetary Policy Committee decides what the appropriate repo rate is for the economy, given how it sees, for instance, inflation and growth going out into the future. So it's looking at all the possible reasons that are going to impinge on inflation and growth, and it's going to decide, well, should we raise rates now? So if we think that there are going to be risks to inflation in the future, the MPC is going to raise rates now. If we think that there are, deflationary risks in the future, then maybe the MPC will cut rates now and so on. Now, this is a good example where academics can lend value to this particular process, because the MPC advice, the Monetary Policy Committee advice, is technical, okay? It draws heavily on all kinds of data that the Reserve Bank of India collects, that the government of India collects. We parse through this data, we try and understand it, and then we use our research on the Indian economy to inform this particular decision. And it's supposed to be apolitical, it's supposed to be based on the mandate that is set out for the MPC, which is to keep inflation at 4%. So there's a role for academic macroeconomists to contribute to things like this. So the public policy here is keeping the inflation at 4%, and the demand is for academic macroeconomists to populate the MPC so that they can help with meeting this particular objective. So it's very exciting. It's very exciting. It's not that. So don't think that a career in research or being in the academy is one where you're just stuck in your office and you're churning out papers the whole time. I mean, that would be a depressing life, right? I mean, it would be a fun life, but it would, what makes the macro, and I'll speak from my field because this is my pitch to convert all 51 of you into potential PhD macroeconomists and be here and do wonderful things, which I'm sure you will all do. But my pitch is that research also has an applied aspect to it. You're not stuck in your office. If you're informing a monetary policy decision, and for instance, if you work on economic growth, then your insights in research can inform how India can maybe grow at 7 or 8%. In recent years, we've not been growing at those rates. 20 years ago, there was this huge debate about, who's going to win? Is it going to be the tiger or the elephant, or is it going to be China or India? And the government is dying for expertise on how we could, realize this, how we could, get 7% growth, how we could sustain growth over time. So the lab is out there. The lab is like your country, but it's the skills that you form and the research that you do that informs your policy decision making. It's not the kind of policy decision making that happens in, most of the time in newspapers where you get up on one side of the bed one day and you say, oh, we should do this. And then the next day you get up on this side of the bed and you say, oh, we should do this. No, it's a far more durable, lengthy, hard process in terms of recommending policies, but which is driven by scientific rigor, evaluation, and so on. So that's what's exciting about being a macroeconomist, is that you can actually contribute to major public policy initiatives through your research. And I'll say one thing is that, success in life. So that my first big lesson to all of you was, don't chase money. Chase what you like to do, and money will come along the way. It will. It'll work out in a way that you want it to work out. Don't go into field because you want to be a billionaire, and then you want to be a zillionaire, and then you want to buy a flat in Bombay and a flat in Goa, whatever it is. Get into the field that you like professionally. You should enjoy whatever it is, art, music, economics. You will know what it is, and at some point you will answer that question. The second thing is, what is success? To me, there are three things that essentially define success, or which govern success. One is your IQ, and that's God-given. You can't do anything about it. I can't do anything about it. We're just endowed with some level of IQ. Second thing is tenacity. Tenacity is how hard you work. That is completely in your hands. That is completely in your hands. And the third thing is luck. Luck, again, is outside of your control. So don't worry about things that are outside of your control, like luck. You may get hit with good luck, or you may get hit with bad luck. That's how life is. Don't worry about things that are outside your control. And don't worry about what you are endowed with. You're all endowed with good stuff. What you need to worry about from your end is the tenacity, is the input, is the discipline, is the hard work. And that's what is going to ensure success. And if there's any kind of, if you think you're coming short, and if you're coming short because you're not putting enough work in, then you know who's to blame. It's nobody else but you.
Super great, sir. That does answer the one question that I had left on my list, which was what attitudes would keep them in sort of good shape because they're going to join research a few years from now. But we promised the students one last question. We have a couple of minutes left on the clock. Varanya, Tushar, since we've got questions from you guys, I'm going to go to Govind, and if time permits, maybe Advait. But Govind, you had your hand up for a bit. Govind, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sir. Hi. So my question was that there are, through macroeconomics, there are different schools of thought, like the Keynesian school of thought, the Marxist school of thought, etc. So my question was that from a research point of view, how would one come up with an economic school of thought as a researcher or an academist? Or an academic, sorry.
So just to sort of share that and filter that a little bit, go in. The I think Dr. Ghate has touched upon that, where he spoke about the fact that it's data that's guiding modern policy making or economic research much more than schools of thought. So sir, if you want to kind of just share something on that nonetheless.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, your goal as a research should not be to come up with a school of thought. I mean, that would be great, but no. It's evidence-based policy making. So what you should really be doing is before you form a view on how the economy works, you really need to have a lot of data and you need to understand it and analyze it. And then that gives you a preliminary picture of how things work. Let me give you an example. United States, Great Depression, right? Post 1929. Keynes comes along and says the only way to kind of, and policy was bungled up, right? Policy was bungled up. Keynes comes along and says that the one way to, the problem is that there's insufficient demand and households are not spending, and therefore that lacuna, that gap can be filled in if the government basically comes and starts spending, right? And that created the impetus for a school of thought, which we associate with John Maynard Keynes, that what you need is aggregate demand management to get an economy out of a recession. Okay? The classical view is essentially that, look, if demand slumps, and going back to this discussion that we had before, then if prices are moving around a lot and they're flexible and wages move around a lot and they're flexible, then, you know, all these markets like goods markets and labor markets were essentially clear, because if there's a slump and demand falls, then eventually your economy would hit some low level equilibrium where prices fall, but markets clear. Now, both these approaches have radically different implications for how policy should be conducted. The classical view would probably suggest, look, there's nothing much you can do about it, right? Because the markets will ultimately clear because these prices will adapt. But the Keynesian view will say, look, unless you actually do active demand management, unless you raise GDP by running large infrastructure projects or something like that, you'll just be stuck in a slump forever. And then these policies are enacted, and then we see actual economies performing. Let me give you another example. In 1980, and by the way, I'm giving you a lot of US examples, partly because the data are clearer and more reliable. I can give you Indian examples too, but when Ronald Reagan became president, the marginal tax rate, highest marginal tax rate was 70%, right? Richest people, for every dollar they earned, they were paying 70 cents on the dollar in taxes. He said, this is bogus, cut it by 30%. He wanted the top marginal tax rate to come down to 40%. Okay? Now, he was influenced by a whole group of economists called supply-side economists. So you may have heard of, people like Arthur Laffer, who is still around, Jack Kemp, K-E-M-P, Google him. I think his son runs a foundation in his father's name. All these guys were saying the problem why the United States is not growing is because these tax rates are way too high. There's no incentive for, and by the way, Ronald Reagan was like an actor. He was working in Hollywood before he became president. And so he probably made a lot of money, and he was realizing that all the money he made was getting taxed. And so he bought into the supply side argument that the root problem with low growth was the fact that taxes were high. So the first thing he did I think maybe first couple of months, 2-3 months that he did was he asked for, through Congress, a reduction in taxes by about 30% across the board. Now, here's what happened. Also, if you remember in the 80s, there was a Cold War going on, and there was this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that competition was heating up, right? When in Ronald Reagan's first 4 years, 3 Soviet premiers changed. I think it was Brezhnev, Chernenko, and maybe one more, Yuri Andropov, I can't remember. Then Gorbachev came along, and Gorbachev wanted to open things up, as you all know. because of Reagan's tax cuts in the early 1980s, growth began to pick up. See, supply side effects began to kind of kick in. And the supply siders were saying, don't worry about the deficit, because the deficit is going to take care of itself. There's going to be so much growth that you're going to get tax revenues, which will pay for this, reduction in tax revenues you're getting from cutting the tax rate. So this is an experiment, right? So the question is about, how do you come up with a school of thought? The school of thought is essentially that supply side economics works. Now, did growth pick up? Yes. Did tax revenues pay for themselves? No. Tax revenues started going down because the tax cuts were so big that the revenues started falling. And even though there was growth and there was some increases in taxes from that, it didn't compensate. Okay? Then, because it was a Cold War type environment throughout the 80s, and then of course in the late 80s, if you remember, if you've read history, the Berlin Wall fell, and communism kind of fell. Reagan pushed defense spending through the roof, right? It's in the context of your IS and LM, you haven't learned that yet, but in the context of G and T, he pushed up G, pushed up government spending because it was coming on defense, and T, taxes fell because he had cut tax rates. And so the deficit blew up and debt blew up. So does this work? Does supply side economics work? Does this school of thought work? So we come in with some prior about how to fix the economy, right? And then the premier of a country enacts it, right? Enacts it. And when you enact it, you end up seeing outcomes in your economy playing out over the years. And then you get your best people to analyze this data and to see what's happening to, it's important that economists basically need to provide projections, what's going to happen to growth, what's going to happen to inflation, deficit, current account deficit, so on. Then your best people come in and then try and make sense of the particular policy initiatives that you enacted. And it's only after several decades do you get an assessment, a full assessment of the fact that this particular school of thought or this particular approach did not work. But remember that that assessment is empirical. That assessment to see whether something works or not is essentially empirical, because you have to have the data to analyze whether things panned out the way that you wanted them to pan out. So, but as I mentioned, and as Chiraag seconded just now, is that your approach really should be to build up from bottom down, is go and gather your data and then go and analyze your data and then begin to form a view in your heads about how things work. And then once you begin to form a view in your head on how things work, because the data supports that view, that's when the exciting research part starts. That's where the models, and then you start saying, okay, now I'm going to model it. Maybe this particular outcome is happening because firms behave in this way. Maybe it's happening because households are doing something funky, or maybe it's happening because the government is just intervening all the time. You begin to form a model, and that model ends up being formed because of the training that you have. You now have the skills to be able to build a model to support your analysis in the data.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Super, great, sir. Thank you so much for that. And so with that, we will have to draw this session to a close. It's been fantastic hearing from you. Some very passionate views and some very, very insightful things that students would have surely learned about careers in research and academia, and as careers as a macroeconomist or an economics researcher in particular. Siddharth, could I invite you to please present a token of our appreciation to Dr. Ghate?
Sure. Thank you so very much, Dr. Ghate. I mean, it was an excellent talk, like Chiraag already mentioned. And thank you so very much again for spending time on a Saturday with aspirants and ourselves. I'm certain that the students have already learned a lot from your experience, and I myself have learned a lot from you today. A particular insight which you shared that is going to stick with me is the fact that researchers are producers of knowledge. It is so true, it is so true. I want to very quickly add a note, as you may already know, that most of the organization and as well as people are thinking differently after COVID-19. and are doing things very differently. And ISBF is no exception to that. And as a token of appreciation, we would like to extend a thank you voucher from an apparel startup founded by ISBF students called Emacity. It is a startup that desires to contribute towards living sustainably by enabling responsible consumption in the irresponsible era of fast fashion. Thank you so very much, sir. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you.
Not at all. My pleasure. And best of luck to all of you. And keep plugging away and don't be unfazed by anything. I'm sure you're all going to do very well.
Thank you.